Test 1, 2. Well, good evening, everyone. It's so good to see you and those of you who are watching online tonight for our Bible study. Just want to say thank you for being here tonight. Hope that you've had a great week and are recovering from the crazy winter storm. And I know that was not the best week of our lives, right? But God brought us through. I thought we would open up tonight with just an old hymn that we all probably enjoy singing, Redeemed, How I Love to Proclaim It. So let's just warm up our voices and our hearts and our minds and sing it together. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed through His infinite mercy, His child, and forever I am. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, His child, and forever I am. Redeemed and so happy in Jesus, no language my rapture can tell. I know that the light of His presence with me doth continually dwell. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, His child, and forever I am. I think of my blessed Redeemer, I think of Him all the day long. I sing, for I cannot be silent, His love is the theme of my song. Redeemed, redeemed, redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, redeemed, how I love to proclaim it, His child, and forever I am. Oh, how He loves you and me. Oh, how He loves you and me. He gave His life, what more could He give? Oh, how He loves you. Oh, how He let Amy keep playing that, I just want you to bow your heads with me and let's just reflect on the deep, deep love that God has for us. Just for a minute. Father, we thank you for how long and wide and how deep and high your love is for us. Even though we're so undeserving, you care so much for us. Lord, your mercies are everlasting, forever and ever. There's no end. We just want to say thank you. We just want to express our love to you tonight in the middle of our busy week and just remind us of how much we need you. So we open our hearts now to receive your word. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.
It is wonderful to be back with you after missing last week because none of us could get out of our houses. And for that matter, there was no electricity here at the church for several days last week. But we're grateful that in less than a week we can go from 0 degrees to 80. How about that? Only in Texas can we see that much of a swing in temperature. But it's good to be with you, whether you're with us online tonight or if you are joining us here on campus. We're a little smaller in number tonight, but that'll build. We're going to have a wonderful spring as we move further into the months ahead. But thank you for joining us. Now, typically as we move into our time, I always raise a question to get us kind of thinking, and we do that likewise so that those that are watching online might interact, and we want to give you an opportunity to do so. If you'll recall, though, 2 weeks ago, I asked the question, what do you like about the cold? And what a horrible question in retrospect. I mean, if I knew what was ahead of us, I never would have raised that question. It's changed my perspective a lot. But since, as Stuart expressed, we came through just an unimaginable week, I hope, looking back, you do have cause to be thankful. I mean, every one of us had our lives disrupted. I don't know anyone in the Metroplex who did not. And yet through that, we were able to appreciate some simple things, maybe, as I mentioned on Sunday, just the ability to get a glass of water. Never realized how I took that for granted. But for just a moment, and again, if you're watching online, you can share this in the chat box as you participate with us. But just something, looking back over the last week, 10 days, something that you are thankful for, something that you came to appreciate in a way that, yes, in spite of all that you endured, nevertheless you're thankful. So I'm going to open it up for those that we do have, the faithful few that are with us tonight. Anything that you would speak out and say, I'm just thankful for? The testimony was that one was thankful that they could receive their family into their home. And Debbie and I would express the same sentiment. We were one of those households that did not have disruption, but the homes of both of our children did, and our daughter has 2 young children, and maybe it was out of God's kindness that it afforded them the ability to have a place where they could take them and assure some level of warmth. But yes, that's a good testimony. Someone else, I saw another hand. Time together. Now, I've heard some very interesting stories, especially from those that were without power for 30, 40 hours, 2 days, that they found a lot of creative ways to stay warm and also to spend time together. And so I have little doubt, looking back, and it may take several months before we can look back nostalgically on last week, But looking back, you'll appreciate, that was special to be able to share that experience, whether it's with your spouse or with your extended family. As I was making calls last week, some of our church members received other church members into their home who were without power. So it allowed for a greater sense of community, and what a beautiful way to reflect Christ in that way. Maybe one other. I'm thankful for extra blankets. Now, Matt was one of the ones that you were without power for how long? Almost 72 hours, and they had no fireplace. They had no alternate source of heat. So he was visiting with me Sunday morning, explaining some of the creative ways they passed their time and survived, thank the Lord. But what a test on so many different levels. So again, I still think there can be some good in cold, but I'm not going to bring that question up again for at least a decade. And I'm just grateful that God brought us through in the ways that He did. So if you're watching online, you have reason to be thankful too. I'm trusting. Go ahead and share that. And let me say, since I'm expressing thanks, I'm grateful every week for Stuart and Emmy and Megan as they help us in our worship service. I'm especially grateful to our media team, Dan, who runs our sound on Wednesday, Devin's running our cameras on Wednesday. We could not do what we're doing now without them, and I'm grateful for their availability and their interest to participate. Now, as I point to their role, if you would like an outline of tonight's lesson, you should see, if you're watching online, a link that will allow you to download it. And I think for this series in the book of Proverbs especially, the outlines are beneficial because we're going to cover a lot of ground as we move through this series together. And yes, I encourage you to have your Bible open, and you can turn as rapidly as you possibly can try to the various references, but I've tried to simplify it as much as possible, and also so that at the end of the study, you'll have something that you take home, or if you're online, something that you can keep with you to help kind of bring us further along into the week ahead. And so if you'd like that watching online, you can hopefully download that link now. If you didn't pick one up, I moved the stands closer to the doors, and you may have walked right past it and didn't realize that's where the outlines were. You're welcome to pick that up and join us in our study. But tonight we return to our series that I've entitled Words to Live By. And the series is based on the Old Testament book of Proverbs, which we've learned in our previous two lessons is really a book designed to impart to us God's perspective or God's wisdom on how we can live life. It really is written in a way to help coach us toward living life in a way that reflects the Creator's insight and perspective. And when we align our hearts and our lives with His point of view, it's to our advantage. That is the honest truth. And so that's what the focus of this series is on. We're looking at the book of Proverbs. I'm not, though, approaching the series chapter and verse, meaning we're starting with chapter 1 and we're going to go a little ways and then pick it up. To do that in the Proverbs, I think, would be especially difficult, especially when we get into chapters 10 and following, where you just have all of these short one-verse or two-verse insights of wisdom. And I wanted us to benefit from the whole of that testimony. And so what I'm attempting to do is to move through the series almost in a thematic way. There are emphases on wisdom, types of how or ways in which we can reflect God's wisdom that would really, I think, strengthen our approach to life. And so each week we'll focus in on a different area. Now, through it all, I want you to realize the heartbeat of this book is to equip us to maintain healthy relationships, whether it's a relationship in the home or in the workplace or just in community in general. When I look at the book of Proverbs, primarily, to me, it's a father trying to advise his son to know how to relate to people in a way that honors God, in a way that allows God to work in his life. Now, again, it's written from a father's perspective. To our ladies present, I think you could almost view it just similarly as a mother trying to say the same things to her daughter. It's a parent hoping to guide his or her child into an understanding that will help them avoid some painful mistakes and hopefully establish in their life a pattern that maintains healthy relationships. And so as we go through the series, you're going to hear me underscore this whole idea of relationships, because I think that's honestly what the book is trying to move us to discover. That said, tonight, I want us to focus in on a key aspect of any type of relationship. And that has to do with the words we use, how we interact in conversations, how we relate to other people with our words. Now, why am I starting with this particular emphasis? The first 2 weeks, we really allowed it to be more of an introduction to the book itself. Why now are we going to center in on our words, or as the writer of Proverbs, Solomon, notes, our tongue? Why are we going to start there? Well, many of you have been reading along with us a chapter a day, and probably you have already begun to pick up the tongue, or our words, stand out prominently. In fact, if you look at the whole of the book, I think there are about 915 verses from start to end. 150 of them have to do with words in some way or another. So almost 1 out of every 10 verses address our speech, our conversations, how we communicate with others. And so that's why I felt it would be helpful, before we go and focus in on other areas of relationship, to start with the tongue, with our words. And incidentally, I also think it would be beneficial given the day in which we live. We are bombarded constantly with words, and regrettably, not always in helpful and beneficial ways. And so if at the start of this series we could gain an added insight into how we can relate to others with our words, I think it just kind of sets us up to benefit in the other areas that the book of Proverbs would help us to consider. And so we're going to focus in on our words. Now, as I say that, there are really 2 general lessons that I would emphasize with you, and then we'll unpack some practical applications of that. The first is this: as you read Solomon's insight to our words, he would remind us, and I hope you wouldn't disagree with him, that our words are powerful. Now, one of the regrets I have about the day in which we live, since we are online and you see all of the posts and the various ways people engage in terms of different forms of communication, and then you have the day-to-day conversations. I fear, because we're just saturated with words, we don't always appreciate just how powerful they are, for good or for bad. Indeed, if you've been reading with us through Proverbs, you may have noticed when we read chapter 12 that our words can either hurt or they can heal. Listen to Proverbs 12 and verse 18. Solomon writes, "There is one whose rash words," you could almost insert the term reckless words, "are like sword thrust, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." Now, as we've been learning, you're going to see a consistent contrast between the wise person and the foolish person. The wise individual is seeking to reflect the insight that the Creator supplies. The foolish person pretends as if God has nothing to say, and they try to approach it to the best of their ability. Well, here, Solomon is advising us that it's the wise person who appreciates that his words, her words, have the capacity to hurt if used recklessly, are to heal. Now, quickly, if you would, think through this day. If we go any further, as much as you're able, replay the conversations that you've had in the course of the day. How many of them benefited the person that you were speaking to, helped them, healed them? How many hurt the person you were speaking to? Solomon would say, when you look at your words, you need to remind yourself that there's power there, for good or bad. There's always that potential to make either a positive impact or a negative impact. Now he carries that further, though, in Proverbs 18:21. Listen to what he says. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. The verse teaches us that our words, if you consider the true impact of them, hold the power of death or life. Now, as you read this particular proverb, you need to realize Solomon is actually pointing that it goes both ways. And what I mean by that, depending on what I say, it might bring death or life to me. See, when I live a life where I allow my words to be harmful and hurtful, maybe in the back of my mind in some distorted way, I think that that's to my advantage. But the truth of the matter, and I think the book of Proverbs bears it out, is what will come around to me as a result of that hurt will be hurt in return. That when I use my words to rob another person of life, honestly, I'm robbing myself. I'm diminishing myself. And so the words I speak hold the power of life or death to me. But let's not ignore it is also directed toward the person to whom you speak or to whom you write. Your words potentially can impart life to them, or they can emotionally murder them, wound them, devastate them. So as you look at this opening emphasis, just allow Solomon to drive home the lesson that our words are powerful. And sadly, too often they're powerful in negative ways. A poet has expressed it in this manner. He writes, a careless word may kindle strife. A cruel word may wreck a life. A bitter word may hate instill. A brutal word may smite and kill. Solomon would say, indeed, that is the truth. And so as we see this and understand this, let's appreciate that we want to use this power that we possess with our words for good. Which brings me to then the second main emphasis that I observe as you read through the book of Proverbs when it comes to our words, to our tongue. What Solomon would urge us to do is this, to become wise with our words. We've defined the term wisdom again to be to live our lives according to the insight of God. It's a skill that we develop. And I use the verb to become wise deliberately. You're not born wise. You become wise. It's a decision that we make to move toward applying the insight that God would help us to understand. Again, it's not something just that happens accidentally. It's something that we cultivate. It's something that we work to become. And so when we look at our words, let's move in a direction that with all of the words that we speak, that we would reflect God's wisdom in how we speak them. Well, how many words do we speak in the course of a typical day? I came across a study, I guess 4 or 5 years ago, conducted by a university in in Arizona, where the researchers there determined that all of us, on average, speak somewhere between 15 to 16,000 words a day. Now, if you're wondering, did they find that there was a distinction between men and women? I've seen some earlier studies that insinuated that there was. Their research actually proved that there wasn't. In fact, I think the numbers came in, men average somewhere around 15,600, women average around 16,200. Roughly the difference of about 600 words. And the researcher went on to say, again, that's the mean average. You need to realize as they observed this and tried to develop their conclusions, they had one person who averaged, I think, like 795 words a day. How about that? Another person who averaged 44,000 words a day. Both of these individuals, by the way, were men. But the observation, those that they made on average, was that men and women alike would speak approximately 15 to 16,000 words a day. Now here's the question. If that's true of us, how many of the words help impart life? How many of those words hurt or rob of life? Now, if I want to become wise with my words, this is where the book of Proverbs to me is incredibly helpful. Through the various chapters, Solomon points us toward some very practical approaches to how we approach our words and what we do with our words. And for the rest of the time, what I want to do is just highlight some of his observations, some of the principles that he would propose we adopt if truly we want to be wise with our words. There are 8 of them, and if you have your outline, you can follow along with me to consider each of them. Starting with this one. To be wise with our words, we need to develop the habit of listening before we speak. Now, is there anyone here today or watching online that would admit, I have a problem with this? Sometimes I speak before I listen. Solomon is saying if we're going to be wise, we need to develop a pattern where we choose to listen. Consider a verse that would, I think, illustrate this. I'm reading from Proverbs 18, verse 13. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Rather blunt, but true. If I don't pause long enough to listen to what the other is saying, then the likelihood is what I say may not be what needs to be heard. Remember last year in our series in James wrote a great deal about the tongue and the impact of it. Remember what he advised. I'm reading from James 1 and verse 19. Know this, James writes, my beloved brothers, let every person be what? Quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. What James was prescribing is that when we're engaged in a conversation, we seek to understand what the other person is expressing. And the only way that that happens is if you listen. So you want to be quick to listen with the goal of understanding. That's why you're slow to speak. You don't want to speak before you understand. Again, I think during the James series, I promoted an insight that had been helpful to me years ago, a book by Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Well, habit 5 was worded this way: seek to understand, then to be understood. I was convinced that Covey, though he wasn't a Christian writer, drew biblical insight into many of his principles, this being one. It's Solomon who says, listen before you speak. Make sure you understand what the other is saying. Or consider Proverbs 29:20. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. Now, many of Solomon's Proverbs are very pointed, aren't they? He's trying to help us, and one of the ways he's trying to help us is to coach us to listen. Now, don't just listen to understand. Seek to understand what the other person is saying. You'll find it will help you engage in a positive conversation. Second, Proverbs also would teach us to engage our hearts or our minds before our mouths. Proverbs 15:28. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Now in verse 28 you see a contrast. The contrast describes the righteous person allowing his heart to inform his mind so that what he says is the appropriate answer, as compared to the wicked person that just basically spouts off. Now, this is different to me than the first lesson where we need to listen. No, here is, yes, I'm listening, but I'm also engaging my heart. I'm engaging my mind. I want to respond in a way that reflects both. Now, what's being emphasized is a righteous person. So again, what it's going to reflect is the heart of a person who's seeking to say and do the right thing in relationship to God. But do you see the value of that? Don't just say necessarily the first thing that comes to your mind. Engage the heart and the mind to reflect upon, to ponder the appropriate response. Let me concede, I think different personalities, and all of us have various personalities. Some people may be prone to speak more readily than others. So before maybe you view yourself as, well, I'm always reflective. Well, your personality may be a little predisposed in that way, and that's good. But even if that's not your personality, the proverb, the insight is valid. We need to pause to engage the heart and the mind as we consider the appropriate answer. Or another couple of verses in regard to this particular action. Proverbs 16:23 and 24. The heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. Once again, here the person is described as wise. And what does the wise person do? That person makes sure what they say is the appropriate response. It's judicious. It's designed to address the situation at hand. And because they give thought to it, they may even prove to be persuasive. That there's a power to this approach to our conversations. Third, realize that sometimes less said is better. Fewer words are better. Now, Solomon is really trying to advise us here. Proverbs 10:19, when words are many, transgression is not lacking. But whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Or similarly, Proverbs 17:27 and 28. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge. And he has a cool spirit, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. So what's the point? Sometimes fewer words are better. How many times have you gotten yourself into a mess because you said something just kind of without giving much thought? You were just talking. Solomon would say, just be mindful that as we engage in conversations, as we're interacting, whether it's in the family or in the workplace or in the community, recognize sometimes less said is better. In contrast, though, realize that sometimes nothing said is a mistake. Proverbs 27, verses 5 and 6. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy. The insight here is, as I'm interacting with people that I care about, and I see that they're maybe acting in a way or responding in a way that honestly isn't to their benefit, to say nothing at all is a mistake. If I love them, I care for them, I am willing, maybe even here, to potentially expose a need. To wound is the verb he uses. Now, this isn't a malicious wound. This would be more like a surgeon performing a surgery to address a wrong. Nevertheless, the insight, though, is valid. What we want to do as we're engaged in conversations is realize, no, we don't want our words to run away with us, because sometimes less said is better. But there are those occasions where maybe we're tempted to be silent because we don't want to hurt or offend the person we care about, when it's at that moment they need us to speak. They honestly do. Now, let me add to that. Sometimes I come across a person that feels like exposing the flaws in others is their spiritual gift. I mean, they just go about singling every potential wrong or weakness, and it's just relentless, never realizing that no one listens to them. See, if that is your mindset and your disposition, you may think of yourself as the most insightful and helpful person by exposing everyone else's flaws, but no one listens to you. They don't. If I want to truly help someone that is struggling in an area that has a weakness, this is maybe a principle that you need to keep in mind. Research tells us that healthy, constructive relationships that involve what we might characterize as negative correction, you need to have like a 5-to-1 ratio when it comes to conversations with people in that way. And what I mean by that, they need to be hearing from you probably 5 affirming, encouraging, relationship building comments, conversation. I mean, it's that they sense from us overwhelmingly that we are for them by what we say positively about them. And when that's going on, when we then speak the word that potentially hurts because of the need, then they'll listen to that. But mark it down. If the ratio is reversed, 5 negative for every 1 positive, they don't hear your negative anymore. You've lost the ability to help. And so I think what Solomon is trying to move us toward is being able to positively affect the lives of those that we love. And in this case, realize sometimes you need to speak up. But when we take that bold step, that courageous step to address a potential need, be sure in your relationship with that person, they've been sensing from your loving affirmation all along. And before I move on, let me just kind of drive this home a little bit further. I think this is particularly true in the family. Especially true in the family. Between husbands and wives, parents and children. Just keep that in mind. But let me move quickly along. Our time is racing. Number 5, don't forget, tone matters. Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, the term soft, again, don't think of it simply in terms of volume. Think of it also in terms of content. Again, I can respond to a situation in a way that feels like I've punched them in the stomach, or I can respond addressing the same situation in a way where it feels as if I've put my hand on their shoulder. Tone. Now, I do think it involves more than content. I do want to remind us that sometimes the content of what we say may not sound particularly harsh, but the actual tone of our voice, it almost works against the very thing that we just said. That I need to hear the actual tone of my voice as I say what I'm saying. It matters. Proverbs 15:4, a gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. Now, what you may not see from the Hebrew text is the term gentle in Proverbs 15:4 is the same Hebrew term that is in Proverbs 12:18 translated healing. It's the Hebrew word marpe. It's translated differently based on context, but do appreciate the beauty of this, that it's a healing tongue. It's a gentle tongue that is a tree of life. If I assess the tone of what I'm saying, both in terms of content and sound, my words can be like a rejuvenating tree that brings forth fruit of value. Or not. 6, be aware with whom you speak. Proverbs 9:8, do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Solomon said, you need to know your audience, because you will not say some things to one group that you will say to another. You say, well, so you're not consistent? No, he's saying some conversations are reserved for people that you know will receive what you say. The scoffer will not. Which, by the way, we need to keep this verse in mind when we think about posting things, whether on Facebook or on Twitter or on any of the social medias. We wonder why things become so chaotic in terms of that arena. Well, part of it is some of you are saying things to a group of people that in no way are willing to hear it, and then they'll let you know it. I mean, the writer Solomon is saying you just need to know your audience. Proverbs 23:9. Do not speak in the hearing of a fool, for he will despise the good sense of your words. There's a children's lesson that I came across that I thought was helpful with regard to kind of discerning your audience. It goes like this. If your lips would keep from slips, 5 things observe with care. To whom you speak, of whom you speak, and how and when and where. Let me break that down. To whom you're speaking, of whom you're speaking, how you're speaking, when you're speaking, where you're speaking. That saying, I think, is largely based on the inside of Proverbs. You just need to know your audience, who you're speaking to, because that will influence perhaps where you go in the conversation. Remember, it's Jesus who said you don't cast your pearls before swine. There's a discernment in terms of what, at times, we may share. So be aware with whom you speak. Then quickly, 2 others before we wrap up. 7, keep in mind, deceit and slander are never a good thing. Proverbs 12:22. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are His delight. Is that strong enough for us? By the way, we're going to come back in a future week and focus in on what the proverb writer says about integrity, honesty, and deceit. That's going to be a lesson unto itself. But here we're talking about conversations. Let's hear the power of these words. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. Why are they so appalling to Him? Because it's a complete contradiction to who He is. Our words matter. Proverbs 10:18, the one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. Now, slander might have a measure of truth in it. It might. Many times it doesn't. But slander is designed to do is to deliberately destroy another by what you say. You're not speaking to the person, you're speaking to someone else about the person so that you might destroy the person. And from God's perspective, that is an affront. There should never be a place for that. It indicates that we're the fool. I came across a story of a woman who apparently had been passing on rumors in her community, and God convicted her about it, so she comes to her pastor and explains, I've been speaking these rumors across our community. Pastor, what do I do? I mean, she I guess wanted to try to rectify things, and so the pastor said, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to take a bag of chicken feathers. And I want you to go to every doorway in our community. I want you to put a chicken feather on their entry mat. Just put a chicken feather down, go from house to house to house to house to house. Well, after a period of time, she comes back to the church and she says to the pastor, I did what you asked. Now what do I do? He said, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go back and collect every single one of those feathers. She said, that's impossible. The wind's been blowing. I don't know where they've blown to. And he said, exactly. That's the power of our words. You're wanting to pull back something that you've put out there, and there's no way that you can. The wind has carried it beyond your control. I think to me that's a helpful illustration of the power of our words, and we need to mark that down, that we want to be very guarded in what we say. And we don't allow ourselves, even though we live in a culture where I think slander has become an American pastime. I mean, it's all about destroying people with our words these days. We need to appreciate that's the mark of a fool. It does not reflect the insight of our God. Well, we'll come back to honesty at a future time. But number 8, and we'll move toward an end with this. When all is said, your words are your responsibility. Proverbs 13:3, whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips come to ruin. Proverbs 21:23, whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. Both of these verses seem to suggest what? My words are my responsibility. I need to guard my mouth. I need to guard my tongue. I need to assume responsibility for what I say. And we need to stop making excuses for justifying foolish conversations, hurtful conversations. Instead, we need to, even as Solomon would suggest, we need to understand I can take responsibility for the words I speak. I must take responsibility for the words I speak. So, we want to be wise, become wise with our words. How do we move in that direction? Well, we have in front of us the wisdom, the insight, right? What do we do to bring that then into our lives? See, that's always the challenge, isn't it? I mean, any one of us can look at a series of these verses and say, yes, that's right. And then nothing changes. So what are we going to do to become wise with our words? Well, I leave you with some simple actions for the week ahead, and I hope that you'll consider taking them to heart. First, prayerfully read a chapter of Proverbs a day. Let's keep doing that. If you started with us 3 weeks ago, tomorrow we'll be in Proverbs 22. If you're watching for the first time, just start tomorrow with Proverbs 1. But the desire is to read a chapter a day, to put ourselves in the Word of God in a way that He can begin to just cause us to think through many of these practical insights in a way that would influence what we choose to do. Now, I use the adverb prayerfully. I mean, 2 weeks ago, we realized that it's the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. And so what we're doing is we're coming to God and we're saying, we recognize this is your insight. So we want to live according to what you would help us to see. But a chapter a day. Now, let me kind of throw a wrench in this. When I was a teenager growing up, I would read a chapter a day, but it would always line up with the day of the month. And since we started already into the month, we didn't adopt that practice. But for those of you, and again, if you can't do it because you're one of those people that just have to finish it, I totally get it. But what if next Monday, which is March the 1st, by the way, we go ahead and just jump back to Proverbs 1 and then go through the month of Proverbs with the number corresponding with the chapter. That way you'll always know kind of where you are. Now, once more, if you feel like, no, I've got to finish this before I can start it over again, that's fine. I'm not going to press you, but I would suggest maybe keep reading a chapter a day as we have until Monday, and then let's go back to chapter 1. Say, but what about the chapters I've not read yet? Well, we're going to read all of the Proverbs in March, all of the Proverbs in April. You're going to get to the later chapters, is what I'm trying to say. But second, in our plan of action, remind yourself often of God's wisdom concerning your words. So how can you do that? Well, what if, say for the next 7 days, you just take this out. After you've read your chapter, why don't you just read out loud? Develop the habit of listening before you speak. Engage your heart and mind before your mouth. Realize that sometimes fewer words are better. Realize that sometimes nothing said is a mistake. Don't forget tone matters. Be aware with whom you speak. Keep in mind deceit and slander are never a good thing. When all is said, your words are your responsibility. What if you just read those and glanced at the verses beneath them? What you're doing is you're reminding yourself of God's wisdom when it comes to our words. And let me quickly add, you need to pay attention to your heart. I mean, the truth is what flows out of our mouth flows from our heart. That's not my conclusion. Remember, Jesus is the one who teaches us this. Luke 6:45 reads, "The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good. The evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." So if I'm really struggling with some aspect of this in terms of following God's wisdom, can we agree it's a heart problem? So pay attention to your heart. One of my favorite proverbs with regard to the heart is Proverbs 4:23. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. So what I'm saying is, yes, I look at this to remind me of wisdom, but really what I'm wanting to do is to remind myself, now this is a heart thing, Lord. I need you to affect my heart, which brings me to the final emphasis. We need to seek help from above. I need God to renew my heart, renew my mind, which in turn will influence what I say. Psalm 19, the close of that helpful psalm, David writes, "Who can discern his errors? Declare me innocent from hidden faults. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then," he adds, "I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." What's David doing? He's asking for God's help. What should you do? Probably the same. I'm not going to be able to bring my tongue under control apart from Him. But bless the Lord with Him. Yeah. He wants me to reflect His wisdom, which brings me to the final application. Let's seek wisdom from above. So much of our conversations need to be influenced by His perspective. And so ask for that. I mean, James 1:5, going back to our series in the fall, remember the promise, if you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. So if what I'm needing is to know when to speak and when to be silent, then that's probably something that I should be talking to God about in prayer. I mean, a simple exercise that I often promote is, as you are looking at a day ahead, identify the people that you anticipate seeing. Then ask the Lord at the start of the day, Lord, influence how I interact with them. Guide my heart so that you guide my words, so that I say what should be said and do not say what should not be said. Make it a conversation you have with the Lord, seeking a wisdom that is His. And I'm convinced that He'll provide it. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, but I pray that it will be a lesson that will make a noticeable difference tomorrow into the weekend ahead. That God will begin to influence our hearts and our words in a way that reflect His wisdom. If you have questions with regard to our series, I've been promoting the possibility for those questions to be submitted. I once again would invite you to do so. You can email the questions to me at stephenlowry@norfolkworth.com, or if you want to post the questions as you're watching even tonight, I'll be looking at the different posts later on, and I'll try to notate your questions. We've not received any questions thus far, which is, again, I'm not disappointed. It's fine, but I wanted this to have that opportunity for your sake, just to talk about things that all of us, I hope, are reading as we are prayerfully reading through the book. Let me dismiss this in prayer. Father, thank you for the attentiveness of these here and for those that are watching online. Of all the lessons that are needed in our day, I can't help but believe tonight's lesson is critically needed. People have lost good sense when it comes to their words and how they communicate with others and what they say. It seems like too many have lost even the filter of human decency. They say things that are intended to destroy. So Lord, help us to reflect a wisdom that comes from you. May our words reflect a spiritual self-control that you make possible, where we speak those words that bring healing and life, and we avoid those words that leave a person in pain and suffering. God, help us, especially in this area. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks again. May the Lord watch over us as we enjoy the rest of this week. Have a good evening.